Hi and welcome to the final part of the Fox Guide to Pike Fishing. Now in tape 1 we looked at the essentials of pike angling right the way through, from choosing the right tackle to playing and landing pike before returning them safely to the water. In tape 2 we looked at ledgering and paternostering in some depth, and in this tape 3, we'll be taking a close look at floats and boats. Now we started this video off with a nice pike that I caught at first light this morning, a superb mid-double fish, nicely marked and in prime condition. And we'll be returning to some more action from this lake a little bit later on. But before we do that, let's take a look at float fishing in some detail. It's a traditional method of pike fishing that in recent times has become extremely refined and highly developed. Float fishing is one of the time-honoured methods in piking, and things have certainly moved on a bit since the old days of the free-roving Gazette bung. I've got some modern pike floats with me here, and I'm going to take you through modern pike float design before Max goes on to explain about how to set these floats up and effective rigs to use with them. And in actual fact, I've got quite a selection here. Now as you can see, there are 5 floats in this particular collection, and I'm going to go through them one by one and explain exactly how they work. Let's start off with this one, which is the live bait slider float. Now this one is a little bit like the Gazette bung in terms of its actual shape, but you'll notice that it's got some tubing running through the middle, and that enables it to slide up and down on the line so that we can not only vary the depth at which the float fishes, but because we haven't got a peg trapping the line through the middle, it doesn't damage the line in any way. If you look at the float shape, it's fairly dumpy, with a lot of the buoyancy concentrated at the top end, enabling it to support the bait, which swims around, searching out the pike for you. And we'll show you how to set that up in a minute. But for now, we'll move on to the next float, which is a slightly more refined design. And this one is the slimline slider. You'll notice that the shape has changed, although the central piece of tubing is still there to allow the line to run through the middle of the float. But because this one's got a thinner profile, it creates less resistance to a wary fish. So it's up to you which one you choose, and I think part of that should depend on the conditions, and part of it should depend on the mood of the actual pike on your lake. If they're wary of very, very buoyant floats and drop baits, then the switch over to the slim line will do the job nicely. The next float is this one. It's a high vis dart, and this time it's fished bottom end only with the line through this swivel here. You can lay on dead baits with this float and it's extremely visible, and if you want to, you can also use free roving live bait, so it's quite versatile. Again, it's got the dumpy shape to support the weight of the bait, but of course this vane is very, very visible in choppy conditions. So if it's really windy and you want to maybe try and just drift a bait without going the whole hog of a drifter float, then this float is ideal for the purpose. You can see it and you can move the bait around quite well. Now these two floats here are both what we term pencil floats. Now there's a slight difference between these two floats which may not be immediately obvious. This one here is constructed from solid balsa wood, it's very long and it has a swivel in the bottom. This one is very similar except for the fact that at the bottom end it's loaded, and I'll come on to explain that in a moment. If you're fishing with this long version, the way to do it is to put a small weight down the line, or maybe 3, 4, 5 swan shot, cast the float out, whereupon it will lay flat on the water, and it should be being fished around 2 to 3 feet over depth. As you wind down and tighten the line, the float will begin to cock. It'll rise in the water and it will sit upright, highly visible, even at range. When you get a take, the float will usually tilt over, sometimes rocking backwards and forwards, but eventually will lie flat and slide away, or remain in a static position, but the take will be obvious because the whole float will just keel over. Occasionally it will slide forward and disappear under the surface. Now the other float is very similar, except for this time it's got a weight in its base, and that means you can use this float with less weight down the line and yet it will still cock upright in the water. It's up to you which one of these you use. Some people like one, other people like the other. Personally, I prefer the longer version, the unweighted version, but there are people who are devoted to the loaded variety. So the choice is yours. But before we move off floats entirely and show you how to set them up, can I just take you through the egg sinker system? And I've got some egg sinkers down here. There are 4 sizes of sinkers, and I'm going to pick up one of each just to show you, because there's a special reason for that. And I'll take you through that now. What we've got here are 4 sinkers: small, medium, large and extra large. There are 2 versions with these splits, which are for changing the sinker on the line, in other words quick change, and without. Now I like the quick change version because what you can do while you're actually fishing is, by removing this piece of rubber, the sinker can be slid along the tube, and because of the split, taken off the line and another sinker put on. So the whole system is very, very neat and easy to change weights should you change to a smaller bait, a bigger bait, perhaps the wind will pick up in a fishing situation. But the beauty of the sinker system is that it corresponds exactly to the grading of the floats that we showed you. Now that means that the small sinker will exactly cock all of the floats graded as small, the medium will cock the medium floats, the large, and so on and so forth. With the exception of the 2 deadbait floats I showed you, all of the floats in the collection come in various sizes to correspond with the sizes of these sinkers. So it's a very, very neat system, and that also applies to the trolling floats that we're going to show you later on, and to the drifter float, which has interchangeable bodies. So that's a very important point. It's a nice, neat system, and it means that you've always got the right weight to match the right float. If you use the quick change sinkers, then you can change weights during the fishing. Wonderful system. But let's bring Max in now, because we need to look at how these floats are actually used in a fishing situation. So what you got for us, Max?
Right, well, the first one which you showed was just a standard roving setup, which is very basic, very simple and straightforward. Now, I'll just pull a bit of line off and we'll show that. Yeah. What we've got here is we've got the live bait slider float, and have a small bead on here and a stop knot. And the first thing I'm going to do is actually show you how to tie a stop knot with power gun, because it's a question that get asked quite a lot. You know, people see and say, you know, so and so, but how do you tie a stop knot? So what I'll do, I think the first thing we'll actually show you how to tie one now.
Okay.
Right.
I'll hold the line for you tonight.
Right. Well, the power gun out the box, and we'll take this off. These dispensers are handy because not only does it hold it and stop it springing off, but it allows you to cut it. Put that back in the box. Right. Now hold the one end of the power gun in your left hand. Create a loop around your fingers, and then use the finger of the other end to hold it open. Then you take the tail and wrap it around the main line and back through the loop. Four times like so. Now, holding onto the tail in your left hand, pull the other one down gently, and you see it closes up and gives you a perfect stop knot. Now at this stage you would slide it up to exactly where you want it to be. Just pull the two tails to tighten it up, and you see that acts as the perfect stop. We'll follow the rest of the rig down. You can see there's a bead that's put underneath the float. That just acts as a buffer. It's one of these rubber shock beads. There's a buffer between the quick change egg sinker down to the safe lock link swivel, which is attached to our trace.
Okay.
Just to sort of reiterate what you've shown already, I'll show the advantage of these sinkers.
On the line?
Normally you would have to, if you want to change the weight while you were fishing, you'd have to break your rig down, retie your swivel on. It's not something you really wish to be doing. The advantage of this, as you've shown, is that we just unplug the tube. You now slide the sinker off the braid.
Have another one.
We now take another one. We insert the braid in the slit, put it over the tube, and then we just re-plug back into the rubber at the bottom.
Lovely.
It's as simple as that, and I've now changed my weight.
Okay, so let's just recap on that then. We've got a stop knot, a bead, the float threaded on the line, the rubber shock bead, the quick change sinker,
And the link swivel.
link swivel and trace.
Now you'll notice actually I've plugged this rubber over the swivel to make it semi-fixed.
Yeah, it's a nice system.
I prefer to actually have the weight fixed so that if a bait comes up and a pike comes up and hits it, instead of the weight coming up with it, and sliding back down the line and still cocking the float, if the weight comes up with a fish, it will actually make the float lay over.
Yeah, it'll keel over.
So you see like a lift bite.
Yep. Okay, Max, that's brilliant. Let's move on to the next rig, and while you do that, I'll just make one comment, and that is that quick change sinker system and the design of this dumpy slider float is perfect for river piking. I know you don't do a lot of it, but where you've got quite a lot of turbulent flow and also variations in flow, the ability to be able to change the sinker, you know, according to the flow rate is absolutely superb, and these are perfect shape to lay on in a lively current and to support a bait if you trot it down the river. But anyway, that's a by the by. Let's move on to the next one.
Right, well, the next one is, this is the dead bait pencil. It's very similar, but it's worth explaining this particular method.
Right.
This is the one you showed, and we talked about it laying on over depth.
Yeah.
Again, the float is attached to the main line via the swivel and bottom end only now, as opposed to being straight through the centre as a slider. The bead and the stop knot fish 2 to 3 feet over depth, as you said.
So let's get this right. When you set the float up, you'd put on one bead, then the float, then another bead.
Yes.
Right. And then above that, 2 or 3 feet over depth, you would tie on your stop knot. Okay.
Yeah. Now the reason for that second bead is, you'll see if we follow the rig down, I've actually got about a foot above the weight, I've got another small stop knot, so that actually stops the float coming down any lower than that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And getting the line wrapped around it. Yeah.
Now moving on to here, this is the weight that's actually laid on the bottom. Now this again is a quick change egg sinker. It can be 4 or 5 swan shot. I personally prefer these because, again, depending if it's really blowy, you might need to increase the amount of weight that you're laying on with. But that's an 8 grams, that's equivalent to about 4 swan anyway. Safe lock link swivel onto our normal trace. Now, as we've already seen, you cast out, tighten up to the float, and a take is seen by it laying flat, as we showed you a little bit earlier.
Okay, that's good. Reasonably straightforward and well explained, I think, there, Max. Can we just look now at the final float rig?
The final float rig actually is a method in its own, and this is for drift fishing. Now, this is a little bit special and an art that is well worth the angler perfecting. Now, I suppose really the first thing to mention is that, as with both our float rigs there, this is braid, and this is a Driftmaster braid, and it's £30, so which might seem very heavy, but when you're winding down hooking a big fish at ranges in excess of 200 yards, the pressure and the strain that's put on a line, it's quite extraordinary.
Yeah.
Right, well, as with all our float setups, the depth is set with a bead and a stop knot. Now, this little contraption on here is a floating boom. Now, this drifter can be fished in two different ways. This can be fished either with an eye and in line, or bottom end only with this boom. Now, I actually prefer fishing them bottom end only with this boom. And this is just a plastic tube that the braid is threaded through the centre of, with a floating body which keeps it up on the surface.
But can I just ask you a question there, Max? Most people up until now will probably have seen drifter floats set up top and bottom end only, stick float style, with the line running through a top eye and then down through a bottom eye, as you mentioned before. So why do you prefer to fix it this particular way?
Well, two things really. I will fish the top and bottom style, as you've mentioned, when I'm in a boat. When I'm really only lowering it out of the side, I'm not casting it under any real pressure. Also, if the wind is very, very strong, that method then allows you to keep the float, stops the float being blown over. If the wind's not quite as strong, then this will stand over and just drift along nicely. It is very important, though, to actually have a curve in the vane. It just acts like a sail and catches the wind. Now, one other feature of this particular drifter float, which is very important, is that the ability to change the bodies quickly. Now, if you just unclip off the link swivel, this drifter consists of a moulded shaft, and the body be slid off and replaced with a smaller one. Now,
superb.
That you may wish to do if you're going to use a smaller bait. The wind is not quite as strong. It just gives you a much more varied system. And the moulded shaft with a domed cap actually means that when you strike, the body can't slip up and knock the vane off.
Yeah, yeah.
Which is a fault, you know,
the earlier ones.
The earlier ones did do, but a brilliant little system.
Okay.
Unfortunately, you know, it's something that's been around donkey's years. People think of drifting as being, you know, a new method, or, you know, a relatively new method. It's actually been written about by Isaac Walton. And
what, the complete angler?
Yeah, and he recommended that you take a Gazette float, and you grease the line with goose grease, and you insert a large goose quill in the float.
Oh, right, in the float, yeah.
And you stand with the wind from your back, and you pay line out, and let your bait go out on the wind.
Brilliant.
So the old chap was on the drifter even back then.
Clever chap. Well, enough of this stuff about goose quills, because that's sending my mind racing. You get on with explaining this rig, Maxwell.
Right, following back down, it's our egg sinker again.
Quick change of course, because of the different size bodies.
That's right. Our safe lock link swivel, and our trace, 18 inches or so in length.
Super.
And as you know, Matt, trip to a recent pit showed just how effective the drifter was.
Yes, it did actually.
On a big pike.
We were out there on a day which was perfect for drifting because the wind was blowing off our shoulder, and Max specifically wanted to fish the drifter float. And as I recall, you put a bait out around about, what, 20 to 30 yards, and the float probably travelled, I would think, something like 140, 150 yards before, in classic style, it just disappeared. And when you see these drifter vanes in action, they're fantastic because they're so visible, but of course there's no resistance because they're flat. And when the pike takes them down...
You never see a take.
No,
you never see a take.
It's wonderful.
It's there and it's not there. Yeah, you never see it go.
It's like switching a light bulb on and off, isn't it? Yep. Anyway, as I recall, you had that take, it sailed away, and I think I was drifting next to you at the time, but we'll come to that in a minute. the float disappeared, and of course because of the braid you were able to wind down into that fish very, very quickly and make instant contact. And what a fish it was.
It's such an advantage, the braid, and it will definitely catch you more pike.
Yeah.
And that's not a brash statement. It's because a lot of fish, when you win mono and you're winding down, because the pressure build up is gradual, it gives the pike so much time to feel the pressure build up, think, hang on a minute, this isn't right, and open its mouth and gob the bait out. With the braid, literally even at 200 yards, 2 or 3 cranks of a handle, and you're locked on.
Yeah,
and the pike doesn't feel it coming.
That was an absolutely fabulous fish that you caught, and I mean, I'll relate the story now, because literally as you landed that fish and we unhooked it, I turned round and I did actually see my float disappear. Or one minute it was
stood
there.
out of the water about a foot first, didn't it?
It disappeared. I hit the take. Now I was using mono with grease, as in the old style. I wound down. It took me about 15 turns to get down on the fish. I had the fish on. It was clearly another big fish. And the interesting thing is, it took in exactly the same place that your one did, or within a few yards. It's clearly a big fish. The rod hooped over and it started stripping line at about 140 yards out. And you know when they do that they are big. And unfortunately it came off. Now I'm convinced that that
braid,
fish...
you'd have landed that, you'd have set the hooks.
The fish was not hooked properly. And I seem to remember that we went along to the same lake just a couple of weeks later, and I changed over to the braid and I had like 3 fish on the bounce, one after the other, without one coming off. So to bear out what Max is saying, using the braid definitely is a massive advantage with the drifter float. I paid the price. I've since changed over to the braid and I haven't had any problems since. But it is a wonderful, wonderful method, and we can't recommend it highly enough. We'll change the flavour a little bit now, because up until now, all of the fishing that you've seen Max and I do has taken place from the bank. But boat fishing is a method that pike anglers have used for years and years to get not only good catches of pike, but to have a really good day out. You can't beat it. Before we show you boat fishing classic style, in terms of static boat fishing and trolling, there is one further use for boats, and not the type of boats that you sit in, but the type of boats that can be used to take baits out over considerable distances. Now on some large still waters where the pike are found at extreme range, it's very difficult to be able to cast even large dead baits far enough to get to them. One of the answers is to use a radio controlled boat. Now this is not something that Max and I do on a regular basis on small to medium waters. If we can cast the baits out, we will. But there are situations on major trout reservoirs, for example, or very large gravel pits, where it is necessary to actually boat the bait out in one of these radio controlled boats. And they're absolutely superb because they're designed in such a way that the bait can be taken out by the boat and a small hatch flipped which contains the bait and then ejects it exactly into the spot that you want. The beauty of it is that the bait settles nicely on top of any weed or silt on the bottom, and it doesn't get damaged at all by casting. This is particularly useful, of course, with live baits, which do suffer a little bit because of the impact of the cast when they hit the water. So the use of radio controlled boats is a very advantageous weapon in the pike angler's armoury when it's used selectively. But let's move on to boat fishing proper now, and we're going to show some fishing afloat, starting off with an estate lake over in Norfolk, where Max and I enjoyed a very productive session in weather conditions that varied enormously during a very short period of time. We started off in quite pleasant warm sunshine, and eventually we ended up in blizzard stroke Arctic conditions. But what a tremendous day. Have you got the team of husky dogs geared up for when we get back to the car? Because I can't see us getting out of that track. No wonder they called it Forgotten Lake. It's, pike fishing in Siberia. As you watch these pictures of Max and myself fishing on the estate lake, you might be interested to know what sort of rigs work when you're static boat fishing. Well, we've already shown you some of them, because one of the most effective is to use a free roving setup, allowing the bait to search the water around the boat for you. Don't be tempted to cast too far always, because it's quite often the bait that's presented right next to the boat that produces the most runs. But by using this method, in conjunction with upping anchor every half an hour or so, you can cover an awful lot of water. Another good rig is to use a dead bait under a float laid on over depth. You can fish this rig at any position around the boat, from far away to right underneath. The key point being, of course, to use a sliding float with the line through the centre with the weight on the bottom, so that the float itself stays in position all of the time. Takes are signalled by the float usually sliding forward, cocking and drawing under. The final rig that's worth consideration is what we term the surface paternoster. Now for this rig, you don't fix the paternoster float under the surface as we showed you before, but you use a sliding float which actually sits on the top, and we'll show you that right at the end of this sequence. It's a nice bend. Got some of these rods out the way. Well, it's a start. It's fighting well. They're real scrappers in here, these fish. That's not a bad fish, though. That's a lovely fish. I think that's a net job, Max. Okay.
Short angle job.
Yep.
Well, you might look at that net,
Nice looking fish, that one, isn't it?
Beautiful colouring.
Yeah, they're fantastic. Beauty.
In you go, girl.
Well done, Max. That's a good one.
Lovely job.
We'll need some scales on that one. That's actually clear now. There you go. Yeah. 20 pounds.
Oh, what?
Just lift a bit more. I'd say dead on 20. They want that dead bait though. Back you go. Nice that. The water's not that cold then. Wondering where that old dead bait float had gone to, Max.
Wondering where the landing net's gone.
That hot float doesn't reappear. Huh? Yeah. The old big mackerel did it, son. Yes.
frantic, wasn't it?
The bait.
Oh, that's the bait we want, yeah. Lovely. I don't think they're in bad condition at all. One or two of the lads syndicate down here were worried they were going back in condition a bit, but look at the condition of that fish. Bright yellow spots, broad blunt. Just over 15.
This is the surface paternoster that I mentioned to you earlier on. Use your pause button if necessary and study the details of it. You can see that in this case, instead of using a sunken semi-fixed float, we've used a sliding live bait slider with a stop knot set so that the float sits on the surface. This is because you can't use alarms from a boat, and being able to watch a float go under provides a much better indication of a take. Boat fishing for pike is a traditional method that's enjoyed a new upsurge in popularity in recent years, thanks primarily to the discovery of trout water piking. Now, this phenomenon began back in the late 1980s with the discovery of a fantastic pike still water. It was a trout fishery known as Langdegfed Reservoir. Since then, Langdegfed has achieved legendary status. It's broken the British pike record, and in those early years when anglers like Max Cottis were lucky enough to be able to fish the water for the first time, catches of 20, 30 and even 40-pound pike were quite commonplace. It's difficult to imagine for us today just how fantastic that fishing was, and it was, if you like, a particular place in time. Having been subjected to so much pressure, such continual pike fishing pressure, it takes waters a long time to recover, and sadly Langdegfed fishing nowadays is a shadow of its former self. But these wonderful pictures that you're seeing now of anglers with no less than 3 30-pound pike on the bank deserve their place in pike fishing history. But the great thing about Langdegfed was that it really sparked off rejuvenated interest by pike anglers in fishing from boats, and the development in particular of trolling methods. Now, before we go on to look at trolling, we're going to consider boat fishing in its most traditional sense, i.e. static fishing from an anchored boat. Before we do that though, let's take a look at rods and reels for boat fishing. And essentially, when boat fishing, Max and I use the same type of rods as we do from the bank. The difference being that we favour a 10-foot rod as opposed to a 12-footer. The reason being that a 10-foot rod is more manageable in the boat, and with a shorter rod, when the fish is fighting hard underneath the boat, you can get a little bit more leverage. As far as action is concerned, we like to go for that progressive action rather than tip action, so you get a through bend, but nice power accelerating right down to the butt and building up so that you can put heat on the fish and put it under pressure when you need to. Particularly important, of course, on deep still waters like reservoirs where the pike tend to get deep and they can put you in a lot of trouble if you haven't got a rod powerful enough for the job. So these are fairly short rods, around 2.5 pound test curve, 10 foot long, altogether ideal. Now the reel is a bait runner. You don't need a massive line holding capacity on boat fishing, because generally speaking you'll be fishing within 40 or 50 yards of the boat, unless of course you're fishing a drifter, in which case use a traditional drifter float setup. The first rig that I'm going to show you for boat fishing is in fact a trolling rig. Before I move on to the rod and reel end of things, I've got here two important items, the first of which is a float, and the other, once again, our favourite braid. Braid is very good for boat fishing, particularly for trolling, because it signals to you every single bounce along the bottom of the bait and gives you immediate warning that a take has taken place, and I'll show you how that works in a moment. But let's just come back to the float for a second. This is a special trolling float. It's been designed in a unique way to fish trolling style and to give the ultimate presentation. As you can see, the line, rather than passing through the centre of the float, passes through the side and out through the bottom. This system here is what we call a trolling lock, and I'll show you how that works right now. I'll pick up the rod and reel and let's take a look at this setup. Now this can be used to present a bait while you're moving and trolling along anywhere from a few feet from the surface down to along the bottom. Our standard way of fishing it is somewhere between 1/2 and 3/4 depth, and it's dragged slowly behind the boat. Now the reason for the float's unique design is this. When you cast out, the line runs freely through the float's body until it hits the stop knot, whereupon the float locks itself in place. Now, with traditional through the centre floats, what tends to happen when you drag it along on the troll is that the float will slide up and down on the line, thus pulling the bait up in the water and away from the depth that you want to fish it. But with this trolling lock, the float remains firmly in place and sits at the correct angle out of the water. It's not lying over on its side, and you can see the sight bob perfectly. So let's take a look now at how this is set up. We've got our stop knot to control the depth, a bead, the inline trolling float, and below that our egg-shaped sinker, which is again the quick change variety here. You can match the size of the sinker to the float and the bait that you're using, and if you need to change, you can. Below the egg-shaped sinker, we've got our 18-inch trace. So the idea with this rig is that it is trolled along at slow speed, and when you get a take, obviously, the float disappears. So that is method number one, a very nice way to present a trolled bait. And I'm going to put that down over here and move on to the next method. This one is a ledger rig with a difference. We call it the bottom bouncer, and there's nothing rude about it or vulgar. In actual fact, the reason it's called a bottom bouncer is because this rig bounces a bait along the bottom. Generally speaking, we use trout or coarse fish, live or dead, trolled behind the boat. One of the characteristics of trout reservoir pike is they quite often lie hard on the bottom of the reservoir and will take baits only that come within a very close distance of them. Now, bearing in mind that a pike looks upwards, its eyes face the surface, what we're looking for a pike lying on the bottom is a bait which literally bounces almost right across its nose and into its line of vision. Now, up until recently, most anglers with their bottom bouncing rig used a simple drilled bullet up the line and bounce the bait along the bottom, but quite often that rig would present the bait too low in the water. This one presents it exactly where we want it, around 2 to 3 feet off the deck, and hopefully right in front of a pike's line of sight. So let's take a look at it now. What we've got here, first of all, is a special trolling stem, and that slides on the line. It's got a free running ring at the top, it's a stiff boom, and at the bottom it terminates in a link swivel to which we attach a 3/4 ounce to 1 ounce bomb. That is just the right weight to bounce nicely along the bottom without hanging up. Above that, there are no stop knots to prevent it from sliding, but just below we've got an oval bead which prevents the ring from slipping over the swivel. What comes next is effectively a boom. It looks like an up trace. In actual fact, this is constructed from stiff mono, and it makes sure that the bait is well away from the trolling stem. It helps to prevent tangles, and it means that the bait is presented a nice distance from the bomb. All it is, quite simply, is a length of stiff mono around 2 feet long between a top swivel and at the bottom a link swivel. to which is attached our trace. Now this is a reasonably long trace, around 2 to 2¼ feet long. And what Max has done on this one to increase the attraction of the bait still further is to add a little spinner blade. I don't know whether you can see that, but it just adds a little visual attraction. Now these aren't strictly necessary for this rig, but it is an idea that you can try, a little personalisation. You can see what Max has done is put the little spinner blade on. It's got 3 tiny beads and a little rubber stop knot to prevent it from slipping down onto the trebles. Now the trebles are size 6 usually, semi-barbless, and onto one of the trebles, the bottom treble, we've tied on a little bait popper. That helps to keep the bait working off the bottom in the pike's line of vision. So let's just recap. What we've got is the trolling stem, a bead, the boom with a link swivel at the bottom and an ordinary swivel at the top, and then below that the trace, the little spinner blade, an optional, but the addition of the bait popper to keep the whole thing working, hopefully right within the pike's line of vision. We'll move on now to the third rig, which is a hybrid actually, and we call this one the Fledger. Why? Well, it's a combination of a float and a ledger, so it's basically the 2 rigs that I've shown you combined. Let's take a look at what we've got. Haven't got a trace on this one because the trace you would use would be the same as for the bottom bouncing rig. What we've got here is the inline trolling float, and below this the trolling stem, complete with the 3/4 ounce bomb, a bead and a boom as before with the bottom bouncing rig, and below that the link swivel which accepts the trace. And as I said before, you would use the same trace as for the bottom bouncer with the small bait popper on the final treble, just to keep the trout working off the bottom. Now the idea with this one is that, as before, the bait bounces along the bottom of the reservoir, but this time the float is on the surface. When you get a take, the float submerges. And that's the difference between the Fledger and the bottom bouncer, because with the bottom bouncer, the take is signalled by the rod tip kicking over. As you move along the reservoir with this one, you can watch a float. With the straight bottom bouncer, you'll be watching your rod tip. Usually with the bait runner engaged, some people prefer not to have it engaged, but with the bait runner engaged, and as soon as the rod begins to kick and give line, that is the signal to strike. So it's up to you. You can either watch the rod tip or the float. And for some strange reason, and don't ask me why, because you would assume that the presentation between the Fledger and the bottom bouncer would be exactly the same. But Max and I have both experienced occasions whereby the Fledger has scored when the bottom bouncer doesn't, when we fish them side by side on the same day. And both of us experienced takes on one method or the other. And then the following day, it's been exactly the other way round. So there must be a slight difference in presentation, although we're not quite sure what it is. Well, that's our experience for what it's worth. And certainly Max and I have enjoyed our boat fishing over the last few sessions. We fished a number of waters, both static, as you saw earlier on, and we did some trolling on a trout water. We're going to take a look at some trolling right now, and hopefully there'll be a couple of pike caught as well.
bouncer. Very gentle take. That big thump as you wind down into the fish. It's taking some line now. Spinning the boat round. These are the anxious moments because any fish on here is a potential lump and you worry about the hooks pulling out. This fish is fighting it out under the boat now. Got the other line to clear. Just gonna move that round behind me. Fish is really stripping some line now. That was a take on the bottom bouncer, and I think I might not have seen it if it weren't for the braid. It didn't strip any line off the clutch, even though I had the bait runner on. I just saw the rod tip knocking, and it was away. But you never know on these reservoirs how big the fish is going to be. Here she comes. Yeah, it's a good fish. Oh. Ooh, that's a lovely feeling. That braid certainly came in useful there, just in detecting the take. Oh, I've got the other line here. That's not a bad pike. Here she comes. Whoa! Spectacular stuff. Tail walking. Wonderful. Here she comes. Look at the body profile on that fish. Picked up the other line, unfortunately. Ooh. Let's try again. Here she comes. Come on, baby. Yes, that's good. There she is, poor thing. Slightly blind in one eye, and there she goes. Better. Yeah. Yes, indeedy, Maxwell. Stripping a bit of line off there now. Don't they hang on, these reservoir fish? Hey? Yes, you would. You've had enough in your time, son. Not a big one. Yeah. Come on, girl. So short and fat, aren't they? Right, let's get this fish onto the matting. Try and calm her down a little bit. I'm using barbless or semi-barbless trebles. The job is done. Look at the body profile of this fish. Very, very short, but incredibly fat. Fed on an enriched diet of coarse fish and spotties. Incredible growth rates. Beautiful golden coloration. Very short, blunt head. A typical trout reservoir pike.
Well, here we are on a lovely day. We're at Farmore Reservoir in Oxfordshire, where Thames Water have kindly allowed us to film this boat layout sequence. Max and I would dearly love to fish for pike at this trout water, but unfortunately at the moment that's not possible. But still, we can show you how to lay a boat out for pike fishing, and this is a very important area if you're going to get into this style of angling. The first thing is that whenever you go afloat when you're fishing, you must wear one of these. This is a self-inflating life jacket, but whatever you do, whether you wear a self-inflating model or the good old-fashioned type, for God's sake, please make sure you are wearing some sort of buoyancy device. It's not worth the risk. Now, that little safety hobby horse over, let's look at what else we've got in here, and I'll go round the boat in some sort of sequence. For powering us around, we've got this. This is an electric trolling motor, and they're very good not only for trolling, but because of their fully adjustable speed, you can also use them for getting around pretty fast. So if you see the pike showing at another end of the lake, it's quite easy by revving the old motor up to switch locations fairly quickly. So a very useful piece of kit. Now, the other thing that you troll on, of course, are these. Now, some people prefer trolling on the oars to trolling on the motor whenever possible. They believe that it gives the bait a slightly different behaviour. That is in fact a debatable point, but whenever you go out you must have oars with you, because if ever the motor was to let you down, then it's a good idea to have something that can actually get you home again safely. These waters are generally large, they're very windswept, and weather fronts can move in quickly. They are in fact dangerous places, so for God's sake make sure you've got your oars. And also, while we're on that subject, you should also have one of these. If your boat's not fitted with an anchor, don't take it out. It's as simple as that. This one's got a good length of rope on it. It's also got a nice length of chain to add a little bit of extra weight, and altogether it's man enough for the job. So I would be quite happy to go out in a boat fitted with this anchor, and that is one of the first priorities when you check a boat, to make sure that in addition to the oars, it's also got an anchor. Moving on, you'll also notice that I'm carrying this drogue. Now, we use this for drifting in fairly stiff winds, so that having perhaps trolled your way along 200 or 300 yards of the bank, maybe more, you can actually do the lazy bit by putting one of these drogues over the side of the boat, and it will open out like a parachute, slowing you down and allowing you to drift very slowly. It can achieve a very, very good presentation on a very windy day, so that you can just inch the baits along at a pace that is acceptable to the pike. So carrying a drogue is a very, very good idea. Just over here, I've got a special piece of equipment. Got two of these in actual fact. These are boat rod rests. They're nice and robust, they're fully adjustable, and the rod butt goes under here, which means that the rod cannot be pulled overboard by taking fish, but actually lifting into a fish and striking a take is just child's play. It's well worth investing in these. They cost a few bob, but they're worth their weight in gold. Now, this is another item of tackle which big water pike anglers will find invaluable. It's a fish finder, of course. The main purpose of carrying a fish finder is to establish the depth contour and the makeup of the bottom on the lake. You can find all of the drop-offs and all of the areas that the pike might like to inhabit. And of course, by reading the depth printout, you can set your floats accurately and know that you're fishing them at the right depth for whatever depth of water you've got in front of you. What they're also useful for is locating shoals of prey fish. Now, these often are the centres where the pike will hang out. They'll shoal prey up and they'll follow fry around the lake, obviously ready to pillage them as and when required. It's very, very rare that you'll actually be able to see pike show up on the screen, and even if you do, in all fairness, the indications can be a little bit unreliable. But for locating prey fish and looking at the bottom contours, these fish finders are superb. And you'll notice that the transducer for the finder is located on this nice bracket over here at the back of the boat. By simply undoing this nut here, the transducer can be dropped down into the water, and it's nice, fully adjustable, easy to raise up if you're coming into shallow water. Altogether makes the whole job very neat and tidy. The cable from the transducer plugs into here, which plugs into the back of the fish finder just in here. Well, that's almost about it, but there is one further thing, and it's very important, not for our safety, but for the pike's safety, and it's what my feet are on. You'll notice that down here in the bottom of the boat there's a lot of padding provided by this extra large unhooking mat. It's very important that if you're going to go boat fishing for pike, that you either lay carpet and or large unhooking mats in the bottom of the boat to stop the pike from damaging itself if it thrashes around inside. Very important point. That just about brings it all to a close. I can't emphasise enough how important it is to have the right equipment when you go out boat fishing for pike. All of these things will either help your own safety, your own convenience, or protect the pike. And because of that, they're the sort of items of equipment that Max and I always carry when we go out boat fishing for pike. And with that, talking of boat fishing for pike, let's do a little bit more.
Well, it's a lovely day for trolling today. Very rare that you ever get conditions this calm, but they're gratefully received when they come along. There's two basic methods of trolling. One is to be powered with oars, the old manual method, and the other one is the use of these wonderful little electric motors. Now Matt has chose to use the oars, perfect for conditions like this. I mean, you can really inch along ever so slowly. Myself, I like the old motor. It's variable speed, and this one particularly, it's got a maximizer built into it, and that sort of posh sounding word means that the electricity pulses through it rather than being constant, and you can get down to, well, as you can see, I mean, we've literally got a crawl going. I'm going along so slow that the float is just making a very, very slight wake. Another beautiful piece of equipment that really, it's a luxury, and you couldn't say that you can't catch fish without them, but they are very, very useful, are the fish finders. This one here has actually got two modes. It's got a three-dimensional view as well as a normal two-dimensional mode. Now if I change this over for you, you can see it in 3D. They're actually showing you the bottom contours as we go. Anyway, I'll switch this back to the 2D at the moment. and I'll try and show you what we're looking for. As the picture's coming across the screen there, you can see that we've got bait fish there just below mid-water. There's one or two other slightly bigger fish, maybe trout, but no pike visual at the moment. Don't actually use these to locate pike, use them primarily for looking for the depth, the drop-offs, shelves and that are likely to hold pike, and locating shoals of boatfish, which are very important. Find the food, you won't find the fish aren't very far behind. The depth that we're fishing is shown up here in the top left-hand corner, a little over 21 feet. Today I've chosen two methods. I've got the float troll and I've got a bottom bouncer. Now I've actually got a third rod made up in the boat, which is there for changing around and varying the method, and that is a fledger rig. These motors come into their own when it gets windy. Rowing on the oars into a teeth of a gale is not very nice. The motors allow you the luxury of having the power to propel the boat into the wind, getting a nice steady troll, and of course when you get to the end of your run you can turn around, put the drogue out, and you can drogue all the way back. The other nice advantage is to actually allow you to hold the rod, and the bottom bouncer method really does need to be held. It just gives you that little bit more time and indication. You can feel every little knock and pluck, particularly using these braids, and as soon as you feel a pluck, let the line go free, stop the motor, give the pike a chance to take the bait, and then wind down. But oh Glenn, I've got not Glenn. Good fish as well then. Yeah. Right. 22. All right. Just hold her for a while. There you go, girl. Yes. This is the life. Just gliding along on a glistening pool full of pike. This is the easy way, as I said earlier. And over there's the hard way. Look at him struggle. Oh, he's a happy person. His motor's packed up working. Told him to stop at a garage and put some juice in it.
Well, sadly, we've almost run out of time on this video. But you know, right at the outset, I said that I thought I was really going to enjoy making this film, and I have. I've had the opportunity to fish with one of the best pike anglers in the country, Max Cottis, and I think Max's experience really showed through on this video. He's been pike fishing for quite a few years now. As I said before, probably a few more years than he'd care to mention. But he came up with the goods for us. We both caught loads and loads of pike on a variety of methods. Max caught one or two really good ones. We had hot action, loads of instruction, and I'll be honest with you, even I learnt as we went along. Before we leave, a few thanks. First of all to Linear Fisheries, who allowed us to film so extensively on their waters, to all the other fishery managers who allowed us to film there too, and especially to Roy Parsons, head bailiff at Linear Fisheries, who was just absolutely brilliant. Thanks, Roy, you're a diamond. Anyway, as I said before, unfortunately that is all we've got time for. So, until the next video, good piking.